Right now we have Richard Straight from the U.S. Forest Service. He is a lead agroforester with the USDA National Agroforestry Center, NAC, in Lincoln, Nebraska. He is a forester by training and has spent most of his career in Nebraska with the State Forest Service, the NRCS, and with NAC since 2000. He'll be talking to us about building carbon resilience through agroforestry. Take it away, Richard.
All right, thank you, Dan. And thank you to Steve and Sarah for organizing all this and inviting the National Agroforestry Center to be a part of it. The longer I'm on these webinars, the longer my reading list and the more resources online I need to be checking out. So this has been really interesting, and I appreciate being a part of it. So again, I'm Rich Straight, and I'm a forester by training. I'm an employee of the U.S. Forest Service, and I want to start off this talk talking about a little bit more on the Agroforestry Center, so you have a little bit of a sense of where I'm coming from. And the National Agroforestry Center came out of the 1990 Farm Bill, so it's been around since then, and it is a partnership of the U.S. Forest Service and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And we are also a partnership within the Forest Service of the Research and Development Deputy area, as well as the State and Private Forestry Deputy area, and which makes us a little unique in a number of ways. And it also provides us opportunities and avenues to be involved on both the research as well as the technology transfer and outreach aspects of agroforestry. Our charge is to research and accelerate the adoption of agroforestry within the United States. So here as a map, you can see where we're located. We have 11 employees located here in Lincoln, Nebraska, and currently the NRCS position here is open. We're looking to get that filled, hopefully in the not too distant future. And we also have a director in Washington, D.C. And you'll notice I have mentioned Blacksburg, Virginia. Jim Chamberlain is a researcher with the U.S. Forest Service at the Southern Research Station. He focuses on non-timber forest products, and we just claim Jim as one of our own. And that's kind of the core team here at the National Agroforestry Center for both research and our technology transfer. Let's see here. There we go. And we also work very closely with the National Technology Support Centers with the NRCS, located in Portland, Fort Worth, and Greensboro, North Carolina, specifically the foresters, but we've also worked with the grazing specialists and the wildlife specialists because they have the ability to reach out to the NRCS offices around the country in their regions, and the NRCS, of course, has just got such a good hands-on connection with producers in every state, and it's a great delivery mechanism for us to get information out. I should say that our primary audience that we target are, whether you call it technical service providers or natural resource professionals, there's that group of people who work with landowners directly, who provide technical assistance and programmatic assistance. So it's state forestry folks, extension, conservation districts, NRCS, nonprofits. In fact, with the small number of people that we have, 11 people total, you can imagine that we can't know all the resources, all the information, all the programs, and the unique variabilities of programs in each area. So we try to provide that information and training to the natural resource professionals who have the best handle on the information locally and who can engage with landowners. So today I'm going to give a brief overview of what is agroforestry, very, very brief. And then as I go through different agroforestry practices, I want to just talk a little bit of how that practice is relevant to the producers within the Southeast U.S., talking about both, as you've heard earlier, and if you've listened to the other webinars, adaptation and mitigation. So, to start off, what is agroforestry? And it looks like a mashup, and it is. It is a combination of agricultural technology, agricultural methods and production systems, and forestry mechanisms, and forestry science and forestry production brought together for a purpose of improving productivity as well as for improving environmental benefits and sustainable food and other goods and services, the production of those goods and services. So, a definition of agroforestry there on the screen, and we usually talk about it's integrating trees and agriculture together to create sustainable farming and ranching systems. There are other textbook definitions that get much longer, but I won't put you through that. And you'll see here just very snapshot pictures of 5 different agroforestry practices. And I thought that might happen. Dan, I lost my arrows. And we break those, the agroforestry down into the 5 practices, mostly because it's just easier to work within the way agriculture works within the United States. In other parts of the world, agroforestry has been done for hundreds, if not possibly thousands of years. And if you think about agroforestry practices as more of a continuum of practices that have very few trees integrated into agriculture with windbreaks, all the way to the forest farming in which we're working within a farming environment, excuse me, a forest environment. So, as you've heard if you listen to the other webinars, when we're talking about climate change issues, we sort of break it down into 2 types of activities, and they are not separate, but they just help us to think about how we can utilize different activities, different management practices, and integrating practices together to achieve mitigation and adaptation. And for all the agroforestry practices, and they all work similarly, but in varying degrees, depending on the practice and then how that practice is implemented. But if you think about integrating trees into agricultural landscapes, so for mitigation purposes, you're talking about sequestering carbon, that is, in the biomass of the trees and shrubs, the woody material that's growing above ground, that wasn't there before. And if you think about a corn or soybean field or a cotton field, or any other small grains, and add trees to it, you have added an additional carbon sequestration source. But by putting that perennial vegetation on the landscape, we also can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. As we've talked about that sequestering, we're also talking about changing up our production system. So we may not be emitting as many greenhouse gases. We're also avoiding some carbon emissions. Thinking about perennial landscapes, perennial trees and shrubs, that's an area that we're not running a tractor across multiple times a year like we might in tillage and spraying practices if it was all row crop. So we typically, those are harder to get a hand around and get our minds wrapped around as far as the indirect effects. But just focusing on those direct effects of sequestering carbon and reducing emissions is, we can show significant benefits. On the adaptation side, many of these practices actually help reduce some of the threats that you've heard others talk about with the greater variability in extreme weather conditions that we currently experience and we are likely to experience in the future as things change from what we're used to in the existing our existing weather conditions and farming practices that we're using. And so we talk about reducing those threats, adding some resilience, both economic as well as environmental resilience, by adding diversity within the landscape and diversity within our production systems. And to some extent, because we are putting permanent vegetation on the landscape, connecting the landscape, we can help facilitate species migration, both plant and animal species. That may not be anyone's primary objective, but it's certainly one that does occur by putting trees and shrubs out on the landscape in an intelligent and intentional way. And the thing about agroforestry is that it does these things, provides the adaptation and the mitigation while really providing some more immediate benefits diversifying income by having a greater diversity of crops, of tree crops, whether it's nuts or fruit or timber, along with our annual crops or our livestock crops. We're talking about the protective benefits of windbreaks and riparian forest buffers. And we're talking about protecting of livestock or providing habitat for pollinators, reducing soil erosion by having permanent vegetation on the landscape. These are the things that meet our day-to-day needs as producers on the land right now, that as my major prof when I was at Iowa State would say, you know, if you haven't got it tomorrow, today, there's no reason to worry about tomorrow. And so agroforestry helps provide different benefits and that are immediately beneficial. And I want to say right now that as much as I like agroforestry, I'm at the Agroforestry Center, I'm an agroforester, I recognize, and all of us here at the Agroforestry Center recognize, that agroforestry isn't the panacea. It's not the silver bullet. It's not the salvation of food production and bioenergy production in the United States. But we take, and it's not for everyone and everywhere, but if we do, as the says in the bottom there, put the right trees in the right place for specific jobs, we can gain more than just a single benefit or single purpose, like many of our conservation practices in the past, how we've designed them to be. And that's one of the primary benefits of agroforestry. So this is not an agroforester's dream that I'm trying to provide here in this picture, but it's to give you an idea of the different practices and where they might fit on a landscape or how they might connect the landscape. And the riparian corridors obviously help tie the landscape together, and there are places where we have woodlands that we can connect with corridors, whether they're windbreaks or riparian buffers, and we do have areas of livestock production. So agroforestry can be a part of that larger landscape, not everywhere like this picture portrays, and obviously this is a manufactured picture. So what I would like to do now is to get into the individual agroforestry practices, and we're going to start with windbreaks. So windbreaks are probably the most commonly used agroforestry practice in the United States. They are probably the one with the longest history within the United States. If we just think of windbreaks are more linear in nature, 1, 2, 3 rows of trees and shrubs that are planted for a specific purpose. And that it's not one design, one windbreak provides all the different types of benefits and all the different types of windbreak functions. But we talk about windbreaks for crop protection from wind. That could be from desiccation, or could be from damage from bruising, or damage from abrasion from blowing soil. We talk about reducing soil erosion, controlling snow, both drifting snow to keep it out of work areas, out of livestock areas, as well as distributing snow across the field to help distribute moisture into the soil. We talk about visual screens, which as you move into those rural-urban interface areas could be more important. There is research going on looking at odor control using windbreaks around confined animal operations, and also for wildlife. So windbreaks can have multiple benefits, multiple purposes, but one windbreak design does not suit every need in everybody. So in the northern climates, we talk about windbreaks many times for winter protection, but in the southeast, they're still very valid. In even the deep south, where we don't have blowing snow and blizzards, windbreaks, research from hundreds and hundreds of years worth of crop data around the world demonstrated that windbreaks can increase crop yield, and they do that because of a number of mechanisms that are going on. The reduced desiccation or reduced evapotranspiration, changes in microclimate for humidity and in soil temperature. So just the yield increase, and those yield increases we talk about are take into account the fact that those trees and shrubs are occupying some of the site that crop used to occupy. So even with that small percentage of land taken out of production, the overall yield from that field has increased. And 3 to 5% of the area of the land in well-designed windbreaks can yield these crop benefits, these crop yield increases. Let's talk about vegetable crops being protected from again, abrasion and the young plants that are getting started, avoiding having to replant. And we also have, there's evidence of different species of insects that their movement across the field or from one field to the other can be inhibited by windbreaks. Now we also know that as well as beneficial insects in windbreaks, depending on your crop, there could be problems where they could harbor detrimental insects. So again, windbreaks are not for everybody in every situation, but they do provide, it is worth looking at. Even in the southeast, around citrus crops, they've found the increased in productivity because of reduced evapotranspiration and reduced damage because of wind banging around the fruit on the trees. And in some cases with some of the bacterial infections that affect citrus fruit, by reducing those injury sites, we also reduce the level of infection by the bacteria. So windbreaks in the southeast. Next, I want to talk briefly about some of the carbon, or the really more to the climate change issue. So here is a study that was done just north of Lincoln here at the Mead Research Center, and it was using Comet, which is a tool you'll hear about in one of the other webinars. And we looked at conservation tillage on one piece of ground, and what the model suggests would be the number of metric tons of carbon dioxide sequestered, and it's 9,203 metric tons. So the next slide, if we took that same conservation tillage, added field windbreaks, only a 5% of that field, and then that's probably how we design most crop protection field windbreaks. That 5% of the land adds an additional 7,000 metric tons. So nearly half of what could be experienced in a conservation tillage combined with windbreaks in total carbon dioxide, carbon sequestration. So again, just a small percentage can make a big difference. But the other point I want to make is, don't chase the carbon. It's the productivity of enhancing the production of those crops that the landowner would be most interested in. And then we also get the additional carbon sequestration benefits, as well as some of the other indirect benefits. So windbreaks have certainly a role in both productivity and adaptation, as well as the mitigation. So the next practice I want to talk about is alley cropping. And alley cropping is probably might be the least practiced of the agroforestry practices. And you can think about rows of trees or shrubs that produce a crop, or a high value trees that produce timber down the road, and planting them close enough, maybe 60 or 100 feet apart. And that alleyway is where we grow our annual crop, and sometimes some other perennial crops as well. The intention here is that there's interactions between the trees and the shrubs. Think about these trees providing very similar benefits as the windbreaks, reducing wind speed, and providing some shade and moderating that microclimate. And then also you have a diversity of crop, and often those crops are not likely to have the similar cycles of up and down prices that we often experience. So we could provide, the annual crop provides annual income, which assists in that cash flow issue of trying to grow long-term high-value tree crops, because trees take a longer to grow, and it takes a while before they start producing, say, nuts or fruits. And so that combination provides a resilience for the landowner, and as well as that tree, the perennial trees being there help provide some of the buffering of those environmental extremes, those weather extremes. So the second alley cropping slide, here we go. Alan Franzlubers, who was with the ARS and the North Carolina State University, working down at their SEFS property, which is a great facility, the Center for Environmental Farming Studies. I believe that's what SEF stands for, at their research farm. They've been looking at alley cropping and how it can be utilized within the Southeast and its effect on greenhouse gas emissions. Some great research just getting started in there. We're starting to get a good indication that alley cropping systems not only provide these benefits to the landowner and to the environment, but also for greenhouse gas mitigation. And so alley cropping is one that, the other thing I want to mention is as these trees grow, yes, they provide more and more shade. The trees could be thinned, that's an option, or we could shift from one crop to another. And there are alley cropping systems that are trees and grass. So the grass could be a forage, or probably more likely a hay crop. But also some people are looking at the trees providing that microclimate and growing biomass in the alleyways, and so providing a biofuel rather than an annual grain crop or a fruit or vegetable crop. So there's a lot of flexibility in the alley cropping, and I think that's one that we're going to see more and more interest in, particularly as people are trying to figure out how to do to get more and more benefits out of the same parcel of ground. Let's see here. So I want to move next into riparian forest buffers. And riparian forest buffers are pretty common. Filter strips along streams and lakes and waterways, riparian forest buffers along streams, lakes, and waterways. It's a practice that has been strongly supported by the Natural Resources Conservation Service, Farm Services Agency, by local conservation programs, by urban centers that want to protect their watershed of their drinking water supply. So riparian forest buffers don't really need much of an introduction as far as the practice itself. However, from an agroforestry point of view, we also want to look at these riparian forest buffers as more than a single purpose function on the landscape that is just for that conservation benefit. We want to look at them as a possible another location on the landscape to grow other crops, grow nut, fruit, decorative florals, some of the other non-timber crops, and that these riparian forest buffers can do more than just the single buffering purpose that we think of them as. And so, and the other thing I want to say about riparian forest buffers is they can be managed. They're not just set aside ground that we plant, get established, and walk away. In fact, those buffers over a period of time will actually max out the amount of nitrogen or phosphorus, potassium that they can take or uptake, and at some point they'll be actually a source of those nutrients going right back into that water system, and so they will lose their buffering function. But if we can harvest them, a portion of them, without getting into that streamside management zone, and harvest off some of that biomass, whether it's for fuel or some other purposes, then we allow that filter to be replenished and it can continue to function. Next practice, which I think is probably the most applicable out of the agroforestry practices, it has a potential for the greatest use within the Southeast, is silvopasture. And I was trained as a forester, and I was trained from the time immemorial. Cows make bad foresters, and goats and pigs are even worse. And most of our grazing specialists were trained up, any tree or shrub in the pasture is just a place for livestock to congregate and to create sacrifice areas and cause erosion. And I'd have to agree on both accounts. But when we're talking about silvopasture, we're talking about a much more intensive and intentional management. We're talking about a rotational grazing system. We're looking at the forage utilization. We're looking at how much sunlight is making it to the ground to produce forage. We're looking at nutrient distribution across the landscape as a livestock eat the forage and defecate on the landscape. We're talking about capturing more of the nutrients so they don't leak out the bottom of the system, because we have tree root systems and we have forage root systems. They work differently at different times of the year, and we can help capture those nutrients and keep cycling them within the system of the trees and the forage and the livestock so that we better utilize that site. So silvopastures, you can arrive at silvopastures one of a couple, primarily two ways. One would be in the southeast, I'm thinking of pine plantations, thinning out the pine plantation and establishing your forage underneath. As those pine plantations that might be in CRP get to that point that their contracts either going out of contract or can be renewed, do some management. They need to be thinned anyway. Thin them to a point that allows enough sunlight to grow some forage. The other way is to start with a pasture and plant trees into it, but not as densely as you would plant a pine plantation. And again, for a period of time, depending on the growth rate of your trees on your site, you'll have to keep the livestock out, and that would be an area where you would hay. But then, once the trees get up above browsing height and damaged by livestock, you can start putting the livestock back in there. So the question is, why would you make your life that much more complicated? And it's because there are a number of benefits of having trees and livestock together. It provides shade, which reduces stress on livestock. You have the diversity of income that working on different income cycles and economic cycles. The income, it's not like you're growing, because you're growing trees and livestock on the same acre, that it's 1 + 1 = 2. You're not doubling your income, but what you're likely to see is the income, because it's intensively managed, is 1 + 1 = 1.5 or 1.75 on the same piece of ground. And we'll also find that forages, we can extend the growing season of the forage as well as enhance the quality of that forage. Lots of things to be said about silvopasture, but I'm going to move on before I run out of time. And the last practice I want to talk about is forest farming. Forest farming is kind of what it sounds like. It's growing a crop, a product, within the woodland, within the forest environment. And because not all crops love sun. And so we're talking about, if we break it down into categories of herbal medicinals, ginseng, golden seal, black cohosh, those are the most common ones. Edibles, pictured there, ramps, growing mushrooms in the shade, growing handicraft materials, exotic woods, vines, canes, and then decorative florals, the red twig dogwood, gold twig dogwood, others that are forest bloom twigs, a longleaf pine that can be used for making baskets. So we're trying to manage the woodlands to enhance the population of those species that grow on our sites. Does a couple of things. One, we have active management within the woodlands, so that we're more aware, the landowner is more aware of invasive species. We're trying to we'll have better management, more active management within our woodlands. We're providing multiple sources of income, and we're also, by growing it more intensively, reducing the pressure of the wild harvesting upon those populations. Folks, there are tons and tons and tons of these herbal medicinals and other plants that are being taken out of the woods, and it's right now pretty much not very well documented. And we're trying to gain a better understanding on how to sustainably harvest these non-timber products. They're not for everyone, and the one thing we're looking at is what are some creative ways to add value to these raw materials. Most farmers want to farm, most ranchers want to ranch, but they're not into making jellies and growing mushrooms. But are there ways that they could have a cooperative agreement with someone to grow and manage these small parcels of woodlands and riparian forest buffers to grow these, that provides them some income, and it provides a new and beginning farmer an opportunity to grow some high-value niche products. Because the real value is in the secondary processing of many of these. So that's forest farming. It's being done as wild harvested. We're talking about more of an intentional managed system now, rather than just gleaning out of the woods. We're talking about managing the woods to provide those resources and good active management. I'm going to end very briefly with saying the National Agroforestry Center, we have a number of publications that are all available online for natural resource professionals as well as landowners. And I'll leave that, enough said on that. We're also involved in working with providing training, providing resources to help establish demonstration sites, and we have some online resources, online training tools that you can look at, and we have presentations that you can borrow and steal from freely. And then one next to the last slide, so Dan doesn't have to cut me off. Yeah, there are groups, organizations in the Southeast who we are working with who are also very interested in agroforestry. There is the 1890 University Agroforestry Consortium. Those folks are extension people, are educators within universities there. The Federation of Southern Cooperatives, who work with minority landowners and small landowners across, well, predominantly the South, they're researching agroforestry. They have agroforestry demonstration sites on their Epps property over in Alabama. The E-Extension that you heard about earlier, well, there's a forest farming community practice in E-Extension. And there is also a group that's very interested in silvopasture, and called silvopasture.ning.com. It's a great place for dialogue, online communications, and sharing of ideas and questions. So there are folks who are interested in agroforestry, and some of those specifically in the Southeast. And with that, Dan, I think I'll just end